Hello and welcome to the second launch event for the Digital Disruption issue of Forced Migration Review. Today's event will focus on borders, technology and movement. For interpretation in Arabic, French or Spanish, please select your language using the world globe icon at the bottom of your screen. My name is Catherine Meredith and I'm the Deputy Editor of Forced Migration Review. A warm welcome to everyone in the audience. Please feel free to introduce yourself briefly in the chat now. You can also use the chat to pose questions for the panelists at any time. On behalf of the FMR team, I'd like to say a special thanks to all the people and organisations without which this issue would not have happened. Our expert advisors, Marie Godin and Derya Ozkul, our issue sponsors, the Robert Bosch Foundation, UNHCR and the International Labour Organization, and our reviewers, mentors and authors, some of whom are here with us today. Thank you all. We're really pleased with this issue and we congratulate you on your contributions. I have a copy of the print issue here, all 120 pages of it. If you have requested print copies, they should be on their way to you now. You will also find the issue is easy to browse in English, Arabic, French or Spanish on our new website. And we encourage you to read it all and share it with your networks. On the website, you can also find our previous issues, as well as information on writing for FMR and partnering with us. Today's event will give you a taste of the articles in the issue, which covers so many important topics. This includes how digital technologies are informing and shaping experiences of migration and settlement, the opportunities which digital technologies have opened up, as well as examples of digital technologies being used on or against forcibly displaced people. Among the many technologies covered are complex predictive modelling, geolocation tracking, biometric data gathering, digital labour platforms, digital financial systems, and the use of algorithms and AI in decision-making. This is the second launch event. We had a really fruitful discussion 2 weeks ago on how digital technologies are transforming refugee inclusion. If you missed it, the video is available now on the Refugee Study Centre YouTube channel. Before we begin, we have a few announcements from FMR. Next week, our Managing Editor Alice Phillip will return from maternity leave and we look forward to welcoming her back. We'll have a period of overlap where our current Managing Editor, Emily Arnold-Fernandez, will be working together with Alice, so you'll see all three of us continuing to represent FMR. In October, we'll launch FMR 74, Financing Displacement Response, which looks at the various ways displacement response is financed, from traditional donor state aid to new investment tools and refugee-led financing. Please make sure you're signed up to our email alerts to be notified about future issues and calls for proposals. You can also keep in touch with FMR by following us on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. Now, I'm pleased to give the floor to one of our expert advisors for the issue, Dr. Derya Ozkul. Derya is an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Warwick and a research associate at the University of Oxford's Refugee Study Centre. She's also one of the project leads for the Algorithmic Fairness for Asylum Seekers and Refugees project. Over the past decade, Derya's research has focused on the politics of migration and displacement, with a recent emphasis on the use of digital technologies for border control and processing immigration and asylum applications. Derya will introduce our panelists so we can dive into discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. So I also would like to extend my gratitude to our funders, particularly Jessica Bider and her colleague Yasin Irshad from the Robert Bosch Foundation. Unfortunately, they're not here with us today, but they have kindly shared their statements, which I will now read. The Robert Bosch Foundation has supported this issue as part of its ongoing work on technology and migration, which began about 3 years ago. Their work in this area focuses on how to responsibly develop and deploy technologies in the migration space to shape migration policy, governance, and practice through international cooperation in order to make it humane, far-sighted, and sustainable. I would now like to provide some further insights into the conceptual framework of this issue. So when we decided to dedicate this issue of forced migration review specifically to digital technologies, our intention was to take a broad approach and explore the various applications of digital technologies, with a focus really on their implications for displaced populations. So in the first launch event, we focused on discussing the technologies used for the social, economic, and cultural inclusion of refugees. In today's event, titled Borders, Technology and Movement, our focus will be on the technologies used by state authorities, as well as international organizations, for the registration and identification of refugees, as well as the technologies used by refugees themselves to navigate some of the displacement processes. We will have the privilege of hearing from 3 speakers who have authored or co-authored articles for this issue. And our first speaker will be Dr. Sanjeeb Hossain from the Center for Peace and Justice, BRAC University. Our second speaker will be Kinan Alajak from Utrecht University. And our third speaker will be Dr. Nini Zhou from Chiang Mai University. Just to give some more information about each of our speakers today, Dr. Sanjeeb Hossain is the Director of Research at the Center for Peace and Justice, BRAC University in Bangladesh. And over the past decade, Sanjeeb Hossain's research revolved around themes within international refugee law, international criminal law, constitutional law, legal history, and politics, with a special focus on Bangladesh. Our second speaker, Kinan Alajak, serves as a research assistant at the Department of Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Also, Kinan Alajak is the founding director of the Refugee Wellbeing and Integration, a non-profit research group working on data-fied solutions to govern the Dutch migration arrival infrastructure. And finally, Dr. Nini Zhou holds the International Development Research Center, Research Chair on Forced Displacement in Southeast Asia at Chiang Mai University. His research examines the links between authoritarianism, conflict, identity, statelessness, and displacement. His work has been published in many academic journals, such as Political Geography, Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies, and Social Identities. So without further ado, I'd like to begin with my first questions for the speakers, which is, how do you perceive the use of technology by state authorities or international organizations in the context that you have studied? To what extent do you think these technologies align with the needs of displaced populations, and can they serve any purpose that benefit them? Can I please start with you, Sanjeeb Hossain?
Thank you, Derya. So I've been studying the Rohingya refugee situation for about 4 years now. So whatever I'll be saying is based on the knowledge that I've acquired. I think state authorities and international organizations, they tend to have 2 goals in mind when they're using technology for the purposes of, with respect to displaced people. One is to ensure that the refugee population of the displaced people, they receive a range of services. That's very basic. But the other is actually to also control and manage that population. So those are the 2 goals in mind. Back in the day, when the biometric registration drive began in Bangladesh with respect to Rohingya refugees, we had representatives of the Bangladesh government claiming that, the registration drive is going to help the processes, relating to repatriation, relief distribution. And you also had organizations like UNHCR saying that, it's really going to ensure assistance in a very targeted and efficient way. We can achieve equity and assistance delivery. We can prevent duplication, manipulation of beneficiary lists. We can facilitate solutions. So when it comes to, and I think these things, they speak to that first way, giving something to the refugee population, to the displaced people. But what's also interesting is that when this biometric drive in Bangladesh began in late 2017, the Bangladesh government also said that it was being done to prevent the Rohingya people from, taking up Bangladeshi identities, like creating Bangladeshi passports or Bangladeshi national IDs, or being able to sort of make bank accounts. So I think, the goals that, these dual goals that I'm speaking about, I don't think that they always align with the needs of refugees. I mean, when it comes to sort of receiving aid and different services, yes, there's an alignment there. But I think the main problem is that when it comes to using technology, especially when it comes to sort of creating biometric identities, the process is so top-down that it doesn't really take into account the needs and the feelings of the displaced people, of refugee populations such as the Rohingya. So for instance, when this was happening in Bangladesh, the Rohingya people wanted their ethnic Rohingya identity to actually be mentioned in the biometric registration card. And this seems to be a very basic demand, but because the process was so top-down, this demand, this desire was rejected completely. So there's always going to be a mismatch. And to sort of to touch upon the last question that you asked about any possible benefits beyond the extending of services, yes, I think that there are benefits that go beyond extending services. I mean, for instance, with regard to the Rohingya people, as you know, in Myanmar for decades, they've not been given citizenship, right? And for the first time, I've spoken to many Rohingya refugees who actually said that despite the disadvantages, for the first time they could hold something in their hands, which gave them a sense of dignity, which gave them a sense of identity. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. So that's pretty much my answer to the first question.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. Kinan, Alajak, I mean, obviously the technology that you've looked at is quite different, but in the mobile phone case, how do you think they can benefit refugees?
Indeed. So what we studied is the use of the Dutch government in the asylum procedure, screening the smartphones of asylum seekers who are coming to the Netherlands. And it's often promoted as means for identification, so identifying the foreigners that they're applying in their country. What we see that there's other objectives that are also promoted alongside these identifications. So, the standard objectives is that it was initially started as means to filter out potential terrorists, that they are among the asylum populations applying here. We also see them promoting objectives such as detecting migration-related crime. What we see and what we argue also in our article is that these assumptions are incredibly flawed. First of all, our technologies are so, even with the most advanced technologies that we have right now, what we see is that there's a huge margin of error. And when we're talking about vulnerabilized populations such as asylum seekers in asylum procedures, have already had a long migration journey, these of course put them in a very precarious situation. And beyond that, it's often promoted as these technologies are, towards the efficiency argument. But what we see from their own evaluation, so from governmental evaluation reports on the use of these technologies, we see that it's incredibly inefficient. These often procedures take 1 or 2 days per case. These are very labor intensive. So what we see also in their own reports, that sort of the efficiency arguments flies out of the door. But even more problematic, what we see is that all of these evaluation reports, all of these governmental evaluation reports, the voice of the refugees, the voice of the asylum seekers is completely obscured. I think we can delve more into it and later on. Let me pass the floor to Sanjeeb.
Thank you for that, Kinan. Yini, Joe, actually, for this question, again, the technology you're looking at is also, well, related to mobile phones, but social media platforms. How do you think they can benefit them?
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Personally, I don't really feel I'm in a position to answer the question in some detail, because my study is about a little concerned with a little bit of a different topic. But I listened to the previous two speakers with great interest. Because when we talk about refugees in Thailand, Myanmar refugees in Thailand, so we have to talk about more than 90,000 refugees who are living in the 9 temporary refugee camps on the Thai-Myanmar border, which I did not study, right? So I know that there there are a lot of technologies of surveillance and standardization and categorization being employed there. But my study was not concerned with them yet. But my study is concerned with about 50 to 60,000 or more people displaced across the Thai-Myanmar border, particularly in Mesa on the Thai-Myanmar border. So I call them urban refugees. So they are not really living in camps. They are urban refugees. They are spread across the country. So, I mean, rather than giving some comments on the specific technologies used by the authorities in the international organization, which I didn't really study, I think I would really like to shed some light on how we study technologies and how we study the state and international organizations. I think there is something, I think we have to accept, there is something I often call an anti-state or anti-standardization or anti-even organization or categorization bias among many several social scientists, including political scientists like myself, which is quite understandable, but not always a solution to what displaced peoples are facing in their everyday lives. Technology is often seen as a double-edged sword. Yes, I know, I have come across and I myself suffer from it in a bit. Technology can be a tool for checking, monitoring, discriminating, and even persecuting people, not just displaced people, of course, But when we deal with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of displaced people, I think there is a need for technology as a tool, like Sanjeeb has said, for good, because it can help in recording data, categorizing data, standardizing data, etc. Right? So I would say technology can be used for good or bad purposes, depending not just on who used them, but also on how they use it. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. So my second question actually is about surveillance. So to what extent then do you believe that the technologies that you've studied, and this includes social media platforms as well, are used for surveying the displaced populations? And can you discuss the power imbalances between authorities and the displaced populations in this context? So can I please start with you, Kinan, and with this question?
Yeah, of course. So what we saw actually when we compared our cases, so we've done the case between the Netherlands and Germany based on Derya's research in Germany. And what we see that the starting points was already different is in the sense that the technology in the Netherlands started with after the Paris attacks. So the whole idea of it was initially surveillance and not necessarily, the identification. It wasn't necessarily for the asylum procedure. And what we also see is that in the Netherlands, it's actually a police procedure rather than an immigration authorities procedure. So it's by definition more of a surveillance-oriented practice. What we also see is that these are incredibly invasive technologies. Their use is different in different situations. So for the Netherlands, and in Germany, it is used once all other means of identification have failed. So when the asylum seeker does not have IDs or passports or so on, in the Netherlands, it's applied disproportionately. So everybody goes through that. So again, reestablishing that, that by definition, it's mainly surveillance. And what we see, whether it's actually used in Germany to support the asylum claims or whether it's used in the Netherlands for more of a police-oriented sort of objectives, the power imbalances are present. They are inevitable. What we see is that basically asylum seekers have no options but to cooperate. As one of our participants put it, you have to play good boy, right? You actually have to prove, you have to perform your refuginess, you have to prove to perform your innocence. So that's why we see a lot of people, from the experience of the people we spoke to, they had no sense that they were able to have power over rejecting, which we also always see in the law. Is in the Netherlands, the law sort of obliged asylum seekers to cooperate in that. Otherwise, their asylum application will not be initiated on these bases. And in terms of the lawfulness of it, so what we see is that, which is definitely not an argument that I'm incapacity to expand on, but it is a very basic principle, such as, freely given consent. And our colleague here at Utrecht University, Evelyn Brouwer, argued that these are completely unlawful because of the power imbalances that we see, specifically in the context of asylum procedures in the Netherlands.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nini Cho, would you like to continue with this question and reflect more on the power imbalances? You do so in your article really well, so just want to hear more.
Okay. Thank you, Kinan, and thank you, Derya. So I have been enjoying it a lot. So yes, as a refugee studies person, right? So we often tend to highlight the agency of, that's what I did in my article, right? Highlight the agency of the displaced people, right? Which is very true, which is very important. But at the same time, we can't, as Kinan has very, clearly said, there are a lot of things, right, that authorities and government, especially those of the developed, materially developed at least, can do, right? So which can render the displaced people agency-less or powerless, right? So yes, there is still, even though we often try our best to romanticize or highlight the agency of the displaced people, but we still have to bitterly, perhaps, right, have to recognize that the state or the international community as large, by and large, have disproportionate powers to do bad things, right? Technology, by using technology to displace people. So that's why, we have been seeing so many pictures, videos, media reports, and information campaigns that show forced migrants, including refugees across the world, being stopped, arrested, imprisoned, and or even deported, right? That have been led to the assumption that forced migrants lack agency or are constantly under state surveillance. But at the same time, yes, I have to repeat that. Yes, the agency and power of forced migrants is generally much less than that of security officials. But again, I'm not trying to romanticize it, but this doesn't really render forced migrants agency less. As I argue in my article, so, and by the use of the example of the digitally mediated reconnaissance by Myanmar refugees in Mesa on the Thai-Myanmar border, and showing how a particular group of forced migrants can engage in counter surveillance by the use of social media and instant messaging apps, which is quite interesting, I think, at least to me, because that's what I wrote. So, but I see my piece as somewhat strange, or perhaps an anomaly, because it doesn't really talk. When we talk about technological disruption and surveillance, we often talk about surveillance as such by authorities, right? That's what they do. That's what they do best. But my article rather talks about checkpoints and patrols on the Thai-Myanmar border that, of course, we can see as crude tools of surveillance used by security officials of Thailand, such as police and immigration, for surveillance of displaced people. But as I pointed out in my article, how technology, social media, and instant messaging apps such as Messenger, Signal, Telegram, you name it, can also be used by, interestingly, displaced people themselves for placing the checkpoints and patrols on surveillance. Is the other way around, right? So yes, again, I have to repeat that again. The power imbalance is still very, very, very big between that of the authorities and that of the displaced people. But still, displaced people have been learning how to live with it and how to get through that. I think that's what we really have to understand, and that we really have to point out. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. We will come back to it with more examples in the next question as well, perhaps. And Sanjeeb, Hossain, what do you think? Obviously, in your case, perhaps they weren't built for surveillance purposes as such, but can you reflect a bit more about the power imbalances and how they can be used for surveillance as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Derya. I'm just going to touch upon slightly on something I said before, and then because I think it's connected to what I'm about to say. I mean, as I've mentioned before, I mean, back in the day in 2017, the Bangladesh government actually said outright that, we're doing this to give services, et cetera, but we're also doing this to prevent the Rohingya population from taking up a Bangladeshi identity through passports, through national IDs, et cetera, right? And there was an IT company, it's called Tiger IT. And the representative of Tiger IT said at the time, they were giving technical support to the biometric registration process. And they said that, we're following Germany's path of registering Syrian refugees. And through this process, we're also going to be able to locate the movement of Rohingya people all over Bangladesh. So, and this is something that was published in the news. So to answer your question, there was surveillance in mind as well, because this biometric card enables that. It helps you find out where people are. There's a really accomplished refugee scholar. His name is Ashraful Azad. He's based at the Kyaw Center. And several years ago, Ashraful Azad basically said that, this process of including Rohingya refugees in this biometric database, it just might become the most effective border against their inclusion in Bangladesh, and also against preventing their movement. And he wrote this several years ago, and I think that he's absolutely spot on. I mean, we always talk about physical borders, right? Like, raising fences and say, it's so high, how are they ever going to sort of get around it, et cetera, and then the patrols. And absolutely, those are all important points and valid things that must be constantly raised. But I suppose something that we might often forget is that, the digital border through these, which are created by these digital identities, these borders are also very high, and they're equally, if not harder, to sort of pierce, right? Because the thing is, the Rohingya people, they've been coming to Bangladesh for decades, fleeing persecution in Myanmar. And before all this biometric stuff started, you had many Rohingya refugees who were in Bangladesh, and they learned to speak the language. They, took up many sort of cultural traits from the Bangladeshi people. And, they also found ways to sort of acquire national IDs. They found ways to get passports, right? But now, because their biometric identity has been taken, their irises have been scanned, their fingerprints have been taken. If they ever approach a passport office and say, oh, I'm actually a Bangladeshi, I want to get, they will get caught out, and they are getting caught out. So that's absolutely something that's happening. When it comes to power imbalances, I think there is a severe power imbalance. If you look at the MOUs that host states enter into with organizations like UNHCR, I mean, my colleague Maya Yanmir and Louis Turner, the three of us, we've been writing about this for quite some time now. And if you notice, these MOUs, they're always confidentialized, always. We don't know what their contents are. Yet, we are told that the purpose of these MOUs is to serve the refugee population, to give them rights. And we've been arguing that it's really impossible to sort of give them, give voice to refugees, but at the same, while actually keeping the contents of these MOUs confidential. So there's the power imbalance is absolutely there. And that's something that needs to be changed.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjeeb, for that. So I will move on to our last question. And in the meantime, I'd like to remind anyone in the attendees, please feel free to write your questions in the chats, either for all of the speakers or individually. So I'd like to move on to my last question, at least, which is about counter-surveillance and agency. So how can displaced populations resist and counteract and potentially influence the use of these technologies to their own advantage? And if they try to do so, what are the limitations for them? So I'd like to start with Nini Joe. Obviously, in your article, you do mention how refugees do use social media to counteract some of these borders, internal borders. Can you give some more examples for the audience and also maybe reflect on the limitations for their use as well?
Okay, thank you, Sami. To those in the audience who I suppose haven't really read the articles, I think I'll answer the question quite in some detail, right? So, and there are about 60,000 or more Myanmar asylum seekers or refugees or displaced people in Mesa on the Thai-Myanmar border. So most of them are undocumented and they are largely immobile. So they are at risk of arrest and extortion if they go out because they are urban refugees. So all these urban refugees have had to take care of themselves and protect themselves from potential arrest, extortions, or potential deportation by Thai security officials. It's been more than 3 years already since the coup, right? Since the military coup in Myanmar in February 2021. So in protecting themselves, in taking care of themselves, those asylum seekers, 60,000 asylum seekers and refugees, not only express their own agency, right, but also significantly enhance it through innovation, testing, usage, and further development of the digital tools and platforms at hand. In this case, we're talking about social media and instant messaging apps, right? So before they go out, all these, these individual refugees and groups of refugees would gather intelligence on the whereabouts of the checkpoints and patrols in Mesa, which is on the Thai-Myanmar border, by checking almost real time. Often it's real time information because I have checked it myself several times. Real time information on Facebook, Telegram, and Signal. Those are the three most popular platforms. And they map out safe routes, right? On these three platforms, there are private and also public groups that may be joined or with or without referral or approval by their owners, administrators, or managers. So I call it the demand or the user side. But on the other hand, communally oriented or tech savvy or even altruistic, right? Myanmar people in Mesa create Facebook groups, Telegram channels, and Signal groups, and acting as or even hiring paid or volunteer scouts and post and share intelligence on the checkpoints and the patrols. I call it the supply side. Or in all these supply and demand sides, the overarching feature of this counter surveillance and reconnaissance is the use of digital media. Although it's also relies heavily on human patrols and intelligence gathering on the ground. So, and I think it's really, really important, it's vital, crucial to see and highlight the people's own agency, displaced people's own agency. It's extremely important. But at the same time, like I just said at the very beginning, we have to be very careful not to romanticize it. So as refugee studies people, right, we tend to live among displaced people. I even see myself at least as a potential refugee for many reasons. But anyway, so we tend to live among displaced people, both physically or at least mentally or psychologically. For example, my phone, I'm now traveling, I'm now actually zooming in from Singapore. My phone is ringing all the time, even while I'm away. So displaced people text and call me all the time. So I feel like I'm living with and among them. And I try, or at least I try to understand or to how they live, survive, and thrive. But at the same time, I have been trying my best to know their limitations to mount counter surveillance in all contexts, because it's very interesting. We might end up thinking that, okay, so all these Myanmar refugees and asylum seekers have been using social media, Facebook, Telegram, Signal, etc., to mount counter surveillance or patrols and their checkpoints in Mesa. But is that the end of the world? It's not yet, because they're kind of fortunate in a way that because the many Thai authorities read and understand Burmese, the language we use on Facebook and Telegram and Signal. So, but they know that they are being watched and they know that they are being monitored, but somehow they haven't really responded to that. If they stepped up their use of technology, if they've stepped up their surveillance of the displaced people, that would mean another story. So I have been, I mean, I'm still monitoring it and how the Thai authorities will respond to that. But so far, still, it seems, at least in this small world of counter surveillance, I think the refugees are at the winning side. It's good to know. So it's good. It's good to know. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ninijo. Can I ask the same question to Sanjeeb Hossain? Obviously, in your article, you also reflect more on the understanding of consent, for example. So how can they understand these technologies, and how can they use them to their own advantage, and what are the limitations for them, Sanjeeb?
Thank you, Derya. I think so. As you know, the article that we wrote was on the informed consent, the theme of informed consent of Rohingya refugees. When it comes to people like someone like me, let's say I'm not a refugee, I'm a Bangladeshi citizen who studies the Rohingya refugee situation. There is a much greater responsibility on someone like me when it comes to doing research, when it comes to sort of ensuring that informed consent is being taken. So we wrote about the informed consent not being taken when the biometric registration was being carried out. But when we were writing this article, we kept asking ourselves, hey, we're researchers, we're going out into the so-called field. Isn't it important for us as researchers to take the informed consent of Rohingya refugees while we're doing this research? I mean, if we don't, that defeats the entire purpose of what we're writing. So, for instance, what we tried to do was, the traditional tick marks that researchers try to sort of make sure that they've got their bases covered, like an informed consent form, an information sheet, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to all that, we tried to make the language as simple as possible. We weren't trying to infantilize it. That's not what I'm saying, but in a very simple, effective, communicative way in their Rohingya language. And we took time. The process of taking informed consent, this is why we're doing this research. It's not something we rushed through at all. And when we were absolutely satisfied that no, we're speaking to a group of people who we feel have understood what they are a part of, then we move forward with the questions that we wanted to ask them, right? So that's something that I think there's great responsibility on the part of researchers. When it comes to sort of displaced populations, such as the Rohingya people, how can they resist? How can they counteract, and how can they, use these technologies to their own advantage? I think the first thing, and perhaps the last thing, that they really need to focus on is to be politically organized. There's a massive Rohingya population in Bangladesh, and it's essential that they politically organize, even if it comes at the expense of, taking part in resistance. I know that it's easier said than done, especially when you find yourself in a situation where you have a very limited right to have rights. So I know it's these things are easy to say, but I really don't see a realistic option other than to be politically organized, which which would sort of help them, collectively bargain for greater rights with regards to using technologies and many other things. I mean, those of us who are a bit older, in 1971 there was Gil Scott Heron who wrote this song. Some say it was a poem. He said that the revolution is not going to be televised. He said that the revolution will be live, right? But till that revolution happens, I mean, I think it's extremely important to sort of keep pushing forward, even if it means taking baby steps forward. Displaced populations, they should form alliances with organizations at the local level, at the international level. And it's something I said before, I think it's extremely important not to infantilize Rohingya refugees. I mean, there's a tendency among us, some of us, that we know better for them and we should speak for them. To an extent, yes. But if you look at the co-authors of the paper that we wrote. You know, there's Azizul Haq, and then there's Tasnuva Ahmed, and these are Aziz and Tasnuva are researchers like me at the Center for Peace and Justice. But the fourth name is Tinsway. Who's Tinsway? Tinsway is a Rohingya refugee. He lives in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, in Ukhiya. We collaborated extensively. The role he played in shaping the contents of our paper was extremely profound. And we thought that this was a good way of not infantilizing refugees, and there was a good way for them to sort of speak what they wanted to say. And I'll just take 10 more seconds. I think I've gone over 2 minutes anyways. If you recall, his name was Mohibullah. So Mohibullah was a Rohingya leader, and he was assassinated inside the camps in Bangladesh. It was a really, really bad thing. And the reason why I'm mentioning Mohibullah's name is because I think he said something which really struck a chord in my mind several years ago, and obviously this was before his passing. And I think it sort of touches upon, you know, the fact that we feel that no, we need to infantilize them and bring them up, and et cetera, et cetera. Mohibullah said, you know, there's a tendency among us to say that, oh, you guys are stateless. You don't really have a state. He said, his reply was, we're citizens of Myanmar. We are Rohingya. We're not stateless. And stop calling us stateless. We have a state, and that state is Myanmar. And we want to go back home to Myanmar with our rights and our citizenship and security. So, I mean, it's really important to sort of listen to what they're saying, right? And instead of assuming what they're going to say. Maybe that's a useful point to start off on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sanjeeb. And Kinan, can I ask you for this last question? Obviously, in your case, when asylum seekers' mobile phones are taken by the police, when they're requested to provide it, to what extent they can resist that and contract that, and perhaps change their, I don't know, their mobile phone, but are there any limitations?
No, for sure. Let me add to all the incredible insights you provided on, of course, asylum seekers, refugees, migrants on the move, displaced, exchanging, using platforms, using technology to gain as much as information as possible. But we also would have to keep in mind is that in our context, they're not really data users, they're data owners. And what we see is that they do try to follow tactics to sort of evade, to sort of safeguard their own privacy, their own personal data, because as I said, it's a very invasive technology. So what we see is that sometimes we hear a lot. So we heard it both from the side of the asylum seekers, but we also heard it from the side of the asylum authorities, where they find a lot of migrants, for instance, decide to leave their phone outside of the asylum centers or drop their phones or just discard them completely. Some of them have actually tried to erase parts of their data. The problem what we see is, and that's one of the major limitations, is that because it's sort of taken, the whole procedure is taken as a surveillance, it's because it's taken as a police investigation, the government does not release information on these practices. So what happens is that asylum seekers between themselves remain sort of vulnerable to the quality of the information and to the reliability of the sources of these information. So while they are with each other exchanging these information, what you see is that they are also not the only producer. So you have smugglers along the way, you have other types of NGOs that they're trying to produce these information. So all in all, I think we are, what we saw, for instance, one of these examples, just to give you a better picture, is we have heard from some of our participants, specifically one, is that they have tried to erase part of their data, trying to respond to the systematic biases that they perceive from such governmental surveillance. So our participants have erased everybody who looked manly, who looked bearded, who looked Mediterranean or Middle Eastern, reacting to that sort of perceived systematic biases that oftentimes similar profiles, they're oftentimes profiled in these states. So again, while and adding again to Nieni's argument is that while we do not want to romanticize the agency, there is action, there is a lot of sort of exchange of these data happening. People are trying to come up with new tactics to meet up these ever-evolving technologies, but they're still very much subject to the issue of information. And I think that also adds up to the freely given consent and so on. I'm mindful of the time, so I will keep it here.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So we have one question in the chat for Nini Joe. How can international bodies intervene to help the Myanmar refugees? It's a very broad question, so the floor is yours.
So I'll keep the answer very short, right? So I mean, the person who raised the question didn't really specify which refugees it's the question about. So I mean, in general, there are three groups of Myanmar refugees, right? So because refugee must have crossed the border, right? So we have to talk about the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. We also have to talk about the Myanmar refugees in Thailand. We also have to talk about Myanmar refugees in India, right? So there are three neighboring countries that are hosting Myanmar refugees. So, and three different countries, these three different countries have three different sets of policies of responding to the Myanmar refugee issue, right? So, but the question is about how can the international community intervene, as if the international community is willing to and able to intervene, right? But I think, and again, in refugee study, there is this trinity, I call it the trinity of solutions, like repatriation, local integration, and resettlement, right? So, and local integration and resettlement are quite very big no's, at least for the Rohingya and at least for the Myanmar refugees in India. But it's yes or no for Myanmar refugees in Thailand. So, but again, how can the international community intervene? So they should not, I mean, at the very minimum, they should not cut the food rations for the Rohingya refugee in Bangladesh, because they are already living on subsistence, right? So if we cut the food rations, it's going to lead to a lot more hunger and even deaths along the way, right? So, and again, the other questions to Sanjeeb about how can what could be done to protect the rights of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, I will leave the question for Sanjeeb. So I think the international community has to be very careful and very, there is no one size fits all solution to all these three refugee situations in India, Bangladesh, and Thailand. And again, we also have to think about timing, time, and locality. So the question is very broad. So I'm just trying my best to give a very broad general answer. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Miriam Dwight in the chat. So this one is for Sanjeeb Hossain. And she's asking, well, she says that I realize you already gave one example, but what roles can transnational solidarity and researchers and practitioners have in safeguarding the political organization of forced migrants and other people in legally marginalized positions? Would you like to answer that, Sanjeeb?
Absolutely, Derya. And Miriam happens to be a dear friend of mine, and it's a really nice question. I'll try my best to give a good answer. So I think there's one overarching point to keep in mind, which is that when it comes to the global refugee regime, the system that we exist in, it is sort of marred by responsibility evasion rather than responsibility sharing. That is something to keep in mind. And I don't want what I'm about to say to give the impression that I would want Rohingya refugees to remain in Bangladesh and not, find other places, better places to live in, even in the global north, or even in their own country in Myanmar. So that is not what I'm implying. However, as long as the Rohingya people are in Bangladesh, right, it is essential that we try our best to reduce their precarious status, right? And that is something that should feature always in our thoughts and in our writing, in our activism, etc., etc. I think one thing that, when it comes to, building transnational solidarity, when it comes to researchers and practitioners, when it comes to even international organizations, when it comes to states giving aid to Bangladesh to respond to the plight of the Rohingya people, I don't think it would be a bad idea if, and I'm not saying that these should be, enforced as hard conditions, but I think we need to start having that discussion where political organization of refugees within the host country is encouraged as opposed to being discouraged. So, help is going to come, but we would like the host country to also significantly, give a great deal of importance to, facilitating that, the refugee population can politically. I think that is one way of doing it, because unless there is pressure, I really don't see how this is going to change. There has to be pressure coming in from somewhere. And again, I don't want my words to be misunderstood in any way, because Bangladesh is an LDC, right? It has extremely limited resources, extremely. So we're working in a very, and if you look at the Rohingya population in the region in which they live in southeastern Bangladesh, it's one of the poorest regions in the country. Even the host population there, they're extremely poor. So it's a very precarious space. So and it can be quite tricky too. But I think what's missing here is that people are failing to realize that everybody benefits if the Rohingya people are able to politically organize and voice their rights. Derya, I think there was another question from a Rohingya refugee who joined from.
Yeah, sure.
Can I answer?
Yeah, of course, yes.
So his name is Muhammad Tufail, and he's saying that he joined from the Rohingya refugee camp, which is really nice to see. And it's also nice to see, particularly because it seems that he does have access to some internet. So that is good. Otherwise, obviously, he wouldn't have been able to join us, right? So several years ago, obviously, the Bangladesh government decided that they would open up educational opportunities to Rohingya refugees. But then COVID happened, and I think that entire process was in many ways derailed. It's really essential that the Bangladesh government, working with organizations like UNHCR and IOM, et cetera, really hands down give educational opportunities to the Rohingya people. I wish I had an answer as to how UN agencies could intervene. Again, I suppose it boils down to applying pressure on the host state. That's something to keep in mind. It's also worth knowing, Tufail, that there are some opportunities where you have some universities that work in collaboration with UNHCR, through which they actually extend the educational opportunities to select Rohingya refugees. So for instance, at the Center for Peace and Justice, and this is probably something that you know, or you may or may not know, we have a refugee studies unit, and there's a higher education access program, which opens up education opportunities to Rohingya refugees from the camps. So these are very small windows of opportunity, but they do exist. I mean, it's worth exploring those too.
Thank you for that, Sanjeeb. There's one last question. It's more about the ethics of research and working in this field, I suppose, which is really important. And I really would like to end with that question in this panel. So the person who's asking it is asking whether the authors can reflect on their role as researchers investigating border technologies, and what are the ethical implications in revealing too much about how refugees and migrants resist and cope with these technologies. And this is a question I'm also asking myself all the time, so I'm really curious to hear your opinions. Kinan, can I start with you? Bearing in mind that we are in the very last few minutes now.
Of course, of course, of course. So one thing I want to say is that it was one of the most weird experiences. It was also thrilling having been on the other side of these procedures, and I got to actually research it from the other side. So actually seeing what's behind the scenes, what's in that black box, in these obscure procedures. And it was already overwhelming to go through these experiences and realizing what's going on, and realizing that and I must say also part of our discussion as we are always very driven by these ideas of, co-creation and co-design and so on and so forth. And I think anybody quickly realizes that we are trying to take a step back. We are trying not to be part of that design, right? We are trying to point out limitations. So it's incredibly difficult. And I must also say that we would have not been able to do it alone without our multidisciplinary team. It's an incredibly intricate topic to touch upon. So we needed people from all different disciplines, from law to science and technology to psychology to criminology and borders, to be able to understand just a very, very, very small part of the asylum procedure here in the Netherlands. And there is much to be discovered there. And I think it is very empowering to share these information, to share more the perspectives of the people who are going through these. And finally, just as a brief note, I think whether we have the right knowledge and the right information, and we were able to access the right stakeholders, I think as researchers, we are still very much limited linguistically of how do we shape the narrative, because it did not start with us. We did not start the borders. We did not start these surveillances. And I think we still do not have very much good ownership over that language between vulnerable and vulnerabilized, between subjects and targets and agents. So I think there's much left to be done there.
Thank you. Nini Jo, what do you think? How do you think about your ethical implications in revealing about how refugees use social media? And again, really in the last 2 minutes.
Yeah. So I had, it was so difficult for me personally to decide what to write about and what not to write about, right? So only when I was pretty certain, I was not 100% certain that the Thai authorities I'm writing about are also aware of what's going on the ground. Then I decided what to write about, right? So do no harm is a very tricky concept. So we have to be very careful, and we have to be constantly, watchful of what's going to happen. So I had to make a very difficult decision. But I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to us as researchers. Sorry, I'll stop here. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Sanjeeb, Hossain, your last words on this issue.
Thank you, Derya. I think we should not reveal too much at all. I think that's a basic rule of thumb to try and follow. Simply because when it comes to the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, you have, there's several entities in question. You have the Bangladesh government, you have UNHCR, and then you have the Rohingya refugee population. Within these three entities, the Rohingya people are the people with a minimal right to have rights. So it's our responsibility to side with them. But there's a severe power imbalance that we just can't deal with tactics that we use.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for all the comments as well that were shared in the chat. I want to remind everyone listening that there are several other articles in this issue that explore these topics in detail in different contexts. And with this note, I'd like to hand over to Catherine for her final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Derya, and thank you, Kinan, Nini, and Sanjeeb. I think we could have gone on all afternoon. It's such an important topic and there's so much to say. But thanks to you for your contributions, which have been really insightful. And thank you to our audience for your pertinent questions. I'd just like to remind you that there is the opportunity to contact the authors directly by reading their articles and looking up their email addresses. So we hope this issue of FMR will continue to spark discussions beyond this event, reaching decision makers, researchers and practitioners, and ultimately leading to improvements in displacement response. For those of you who missed the start of the session, let me just reiterate that the whole of the issue is available on the FMR website in English, Arabic, Spanish, and French. We encourage you to dive in and share it with your networks. And please keep in touch with Forced Migration Review and look out for future events, issues, and calls for proposals by signing up for email alerts on our website and following us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Facebook. So goodbye from me and the FMR team. Thanks, everyone.